Imagine, if you will, the entirety of global public health as an interconnected biological nervous system.
Oh, like that.
Yeah, right. Because for the vast majority of human history, human societies operated kind of like isolated, maybe single-celled organisms
Mm-mm.
or like very rudimentary disconnected nerve clusters.
Sure.
If an infection broke out or there was a localized famine or a shift in the local environment, that crisis stayed local. It was contained simply by the sheer unyielding friction of geography. A mountain range or an ocean was an absolute barrier.
Right. Distance was the ultimate quarantine.
Exactly. But today, over a remarkably short evolutionary period, we've developed into this complex, highly sensitized planetary nervous system. Now, an impulse fired in one single node.
And that could be anything, right?
Yeah, say a novel respiratory pathogen emerging in a rural market, or a sudden shift in international trade policy drafted in some boardroom, or even a highly targeted marketing campaign for a new ultra-processed food. That impulse travels almost instantaneously across the globe. That one local spark creates a massive, systemic, total body reaction.
It's a profound structural shift. And that metaphor perfectly captures the urgency of what we're dealing with today.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changes how we must practice medicine, how we design public health interventions, and frankly, how we understand risk. We're no longer just treating the isolated cell.
We're trying to manage and heal the entire nervous system.
Exactly. So, welcome to your custom-tailored deep dive. Whether you're a medical student cramming for boards, a junior doctor trying to understand why a certain medication is suddenly unavailable on your ward, a public health trainee, or an allied health professional trying to make sense of the macro forces shaping your daily clinical encounters.
This is specifically for you. We are speaking directly to you, the learner.
And our mission today is highly specific and honestly incredibly vital.
Yeah, we're using chapter 1.5 of the Oxford textbook of global public health, the one authored by Kelly Lee. We're using that as our structural spine.
But we aren't just going to sit here and read it to you.
No, definitely not. Our goal is to clarify the major frameworks, strengthen your clinical reasoning, and really support your active reading of the text. Listen to this deep dive alongside your studies. It's a companion. It's not a replacement. We want to help you build those conceptual memory anchors so you can start seeing the patterns in your own practice.
Because globalization isn't just a dry economics term you hear on the evening news. It is the fundamental architecture dictating who gets sick, who gets care, and who is left behind.
Okay, let's unpack this. To build our conceptual framework today, where do we start?
We have to move our mindset from traditional local epidemiology to transboundary systems thinking. The core progression we'll be tracing throughout this entire discussion is how globalization reshapes the very determinants of health.
So tracing that pathway.
Right. How a globalized risk leads to a new exposure, which dictates a specific clinical outcome, which then necessitates a completely different scale of intervention, ultimately resulting in a profound system impact. We're going to look at the why behind the decisions made in global public health arenas, not just the what.
So if we're going to look at the why, we have to start by actually defining what we're talking about. People throw the word globalization around constantly.
They do.
But the textbook doesn't just hand-wave it. It rigorously defines globalization through three interconnected types of social change. The first one is spatial change. The text wonderfully calls this the death of distance.
It's a great phrase.
It really is. It's about how we interact across physical space. We're talking about long-haul commercial flights that can carry a biological vector anywhere on the planet in under 24 hours. We're talking about global financial trading floors linked by fiber optic cables and the massive, instantaneous virtual communities on platforms like Twitter and Facebook.
Distance just doesn't protect us or isolate us the way it used to.
Right. If we go back to our nervous system metaphor, it's like the physical axons connecting the nodes have suddenly been wrapped in myelin. The signal jumps across the gaps flawlessly.
That is precisely it. The friction of space has been nearly eliminated. What's truly fascinating here is the sheer intensity and extensity of these linkages. They aren't just faster, they are denser. Now, the second change the text identifies is temporal.
Time.
Yes, the acceleration of time frames. We're currently experiencing 24-hour continuous global financial transactions. Manufacturing, agricultural processing, construction, they're heavily mechanized and sped up to rates that were unimaginable even a century ago.
So how does that hit public health?
Well, the time frame in which a public health intervention can be deployed, or conversely, a novel pathogen can spread, is vastly compressed. Time itself is behaving differently in the context of disease transmission and economic shocks. We simply have less time to react.
And the third change is cognitive change. I think this one really shifts how we perceive the world and our place in it. It's the ascendance of English as a dominant, unifying language for science, commerce, and diplomacy. It's the global spread of human rights frameworks, which is incredibly positive. But on the flip side, it's also the perceived threat of a dominant Western culture overriding and erasing local traditional beliefs and systems.
It's fundamentally about how ideas, both protective ideas like hygiene practices and harmful ideas like certain diet cultures, go viral and reshape local identities.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to pause and ask a fundamental question. Why are these spatial, temporal, and cognitive changes happening right now?
This brings us to a critical thinking framework regarding the actual drivers of globalization. The textbook presents a debate with three main schools of thought, and it is important to understand each one for your exams and your practice.
Okay, lay them out for us.
The first school views technology as the primary driver. Plunging sea and air freight costs and the absolute explosion of information and communication technologies, or ICTs, are seen as the root cause. From this perspective, the microchip in the shipping container built the modern world.
But then there's the second school, which argues that technology is just an enabler. It's just the tool, not the actual driver.
Exactly.
The real driver is economic capitalism. It's Adam Smith's invisible hand, but operating on a massive planetary scale. You have multinational producers desperately seeking the cheapest possible labor and the cheapest raw materials to maximize profit.
And on the other side of the equation, you have billions of consumers demanding the lowest possible prices for goods. That insatiable economic hunger is what actually forces the technology to evolve and spread. The technology doesn't invent itself. The market demands it.
And this raises an important question about the rules of that market, which leads us to the third perspective, ideology, specifically the spread of neoliberalism.
Now, as we navigate this specific concept, it is crucial to state clearly for our learners that we are maintaining strict professional neutrality here. We are simply reporting the text outline of neoliberalism as a theoretical driver of globalization.
We're not taking a political side.
No, we're just unpacking the framework. In this specific macroeconomic context, neoliberalism refers to policies heavily favoring deregulation, privatization of state assets, and minimal state intervention in free markets. The core argument here is that these specific ideological choices, not just inevitable technological evolution or abstract economic forces, have deliberately shaped global industrial and trade policies since the early 1980s.
And the text also importantly notes that the 2007 global financial crisis led to significant, widespread critiques of this model, right? And initiated loud calls for stronger global regulation.
It did. Understanding that ideological split directly feeds into the massive dichotomy between two camps the text identifies, the globalists and the critics.
Let's look at the globalists first. They look at the data and see this interconnectedness as a pathway to shared prosperity. They see incredible market efficiency, technological miracles, and the eventual uplifting of all developing economies. They certainly acknowledge bumps in the road, but they view the overall trajectory as fundamentally progressive and beneficial.
But the critics look the exact same data and see deeply reinforced inequalities. They view this process as a form of neocolonialism, arguing that wealth does not inherently trickle down.
Right.
They point out that without strong, intentional redistributive policies, the gap between the ultra-rich haves and the marginalized have-nots simply widens, leading to a system that is fundamentally unsustainable, both socially and environmentally.
For you as a learner, whether you're on the wards or in a policy seminar, understanding this debate is absolutely vital. Why? Because it dictates how public health interventions are funded, prioritized, and governed.
Precisely. If we're facing a pandemic, are we relying purely on free market forces and intellectual property laws to distribute vaccines? Or do we require robust, state-led, transboundary regulation and intervention? The answer to that question depends entirely on which framework of globalization is driving your nation's policy.
So, if neoliberalism and market forces are driving these global changes, how does that actually play out in a patient's life? We have to look at the massive entities making the products. We can't talk about public health today without talking about transnational corporations or TNCs.
This brings us right to the commercial determinants of health.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
To set the stage for how these corporations operate, we must briefly track the system impact of the global economy. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions were established, specifically the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization.
And their original mandate was to stabilize economies and prevent another world war.
Yes, however, fast forward to recent decades, and a wave of financial deregulation has led to 24-hour global trading. To give you a sense of the sheer scale we are dealing with, the text notes that global financial assets boomed from $136 trillion in 2005 to an expected $371 trillion by 2020.
That's a massive, unprecedented pool of highly mobile capital, and it drives the rapid restructuring of global industries.
And those industries directly, intimately impact patient outcomes. Let's dive into the textbook-specific case studies on these transnational corporations.
First up, an industry every single clinician interacts with daily: Big Pharma. I want to look at the structure here because it feels like there are fewer and fewer of these massive pharmaceutical companies these days. Is that just my perception, or is the industry actually shrinking in terms of players?
Your perception is entirely correct. The name of the game in modern pharmaceuticals is immense consolidation. According to the textbook, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies went from holding roughly 33% of total world revenue in 1992 to holding 46% by 2011. They are massive global behemoths.
Wow.
But as public health practitioners, we need to look at the why behind that consolidation. It is a structural reality of the free market. The data in the text states that it costs an average of $4 billion to develop and bring a single new drug to market. Let that number sink in.
4 billion.
To survive that staggering level of research and development risk, companies feel they must achieve massive economies of scale through mergers and acquisitions. But this creates a profound life-or-death tension. The corporate requirement to recoup those billions in R&D costs through high patent-protected prices directly conflicts with the global public health mandate to ensure that vulnerable populations, especially in developing nations, have access to essential, life-saving medicines.
That tension is just incredible. It's the ultimate friction point between human health and global capitalism. And that tension actually exploded onto the international stage, didn't it? It led to major global health diplomacy efforts, specifically the 2001 Doha Declaration on Intellectual Property Rights and Public Health.
Yes.
This agreement was essentially global governance having to step in to create a remedy.
Hey.
It tried to clarify legal flexibility so that developing countries could prioritize public health and the distribution of essential medicines over strict intellectual property and patent protections when facing a national health emergency, like the HIV/AIDS crisis.
Exactly. It is a perfect illustration of our framework. A globalized economic risk, strict patent laws, leads to an exposure, lack of access to medicine, which dictates a clinical outcome, high mortality, necessitating a system-level intervention. The Doha Declaration.
That pattern recognition is so key.
Let us examine another heavily consolidated commercial determinant: big tobacco. Historically, public health campaigns, taxation, and strict regulations have successfully driven down smoking prevalence in traditional Western markets like the US and the UK. But transnational tobacco companies, or TTCs, have not simply accepted defeat and closed up shop.
Obviously not.
Instead, they have aggressively utilized the modern tools of globalization, trade liberalization, foreign direct investment, and incredibly sophisticated global marketing to pivot and target emerging markets in Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Africa.
And the consolidation in tobacco is even more staggering than pharma. Just 4 companies control 62% of the entire world's cigarette market, and that's even when you exclude China's massive state monopoly. What they're doing is effectively exporting the devastating burden of chronic respiratory and cardiovascular diseases from the developed world directly to the developing world.
And we see a deeply parallel mechanism operating with big food. The global expansion of the transnational food industry is intricately, undeniably linked to the worldwide rise in non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. Through globalized supply chains, we are seeing the aggressive export of energy-dense foods, highly processed products that are exceptionally high in fats, sugars, and salts, but extremely low in actual nutritional value.
What I find so wild and honestly frustrating from a clinical standpoint is looking at how the food industry responds to the global health crisis they are helping to create. The text cites an assessment of the top 25 global food manufacturers. Despite all the PR campaigns you see, only a tiny fraction of them are actually voluntarily reducing salt, sugar, and trans fats in their products in any meaningful way.
It perfectly highlights the tension between relying on voluntary industry codes of conduct versus implementing required state-led government regulation. When profit maximization and shareholder returns are the primary legal drivers of a corporation, voluntary public health measures almost always fall devastatingly short.
It's just structurally misaligned.
Furthermore, it is critical to understand that globalization doesn't just facilitate the frictionless flow of legal regulated goods. It also immensely facilitates illicit trade, which introduces direct, immediate hazards to population health.
The stats on this in the textbook are frankly terrifying. Counterfeit goods make up 5 to 7% of all world trade. And when it comes to pharmaceuticals, the World Health Organization estimates that 10% of global pharmaceuticals are fake. But it's not evenly distributed?
No, it is highly concentrated in specific regions.
Right. In some places, the numbers are apocalyptic. For example, in major pharmacies in Lagos, Nigeria, up to 80% of distributed drugs were found to be counterfeit. Think about what that means for a clinician on the ground. You're an attending trying to treat a child with severe malaria or an adult in a hypertensive crisis, and the medication you are pushing, IV, might literally just be chalk and water.
Yeah.
It's a complete betrayal of the clinical social contract.
The systemic impact is catastrophic and heavily documented. The text highlights the particularly tragic case of counterfeit baby milk powder in rural China, an event which directly caused the deaths of at least 50 infants and severe acute malnutrition in hundreds more.
Unbelievable.
Globalization allowed the supply chains for these illicit, deadly products to become incredibly complex and hidden, crossing multiple regional and national borders before ever reaching the consumer. This makes tracing the original hazard and regulating the exposure incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for under-resourced local health authorities.
It's just devastating. It really makes you rethink the hidden costs of cheap global shipping. Okay, let's transition. Goods move, capital moves, but so do people. We're living in what researchers Castles and Miller famously call the age of migration.
The sheer volume of human movement today is entirely unprecedented in human history. We are seeing approximately 214 million international migrants annually. Furthermore, over 500 million people cross international borders on commercial airlines every single year.
500 million.
When you are a public health official modeling disease transmission, this massive, frictionless transport network is exactly what novel pathogens exploit.
But it's not just patients moving or tourists. It's the healthcare providers themselves. I want to talk about the healthcare brain drain, because this directly impacts the learners listening to this right now.
The brain drain is a profound systems failure, and it is entirely driven by global economic imbalances. We must contextualize this clinically and systemically. Look at the African continent. The African region bears roughly 24% of the total global burden of disease, yet it retains only 3% of the global health workforce.
That ratio is completely inverted.
The text notes a devastating statistic. On average, 1 in 4 doctors who were trained in Africa is currently working in an OECD country, meaning a high-income nation like the US, the UK, or Canada.
So what does this actually mean in practice? It means the poorest, most resource-strapped countries on Earth are effectively subsidizing the healthcare systems of the wealthiest countries. They spend their limited GDP training doctors and nurses, who then understandably migrate for better wages, safer working conditions, and better opportunities for their families.
The individual clinician's decision to migrate is completely rational.
Of course it is. But the macro effect is that it leaves highly vulnerable populations in their home countries completely stripped of clinical care. If you are a junior doctor in London or New York, you are likely working alongside brilliant colleagues who represent a massive loss of clinical capacity somewhere else in the world.
Accompanying this transnational migration is a massive wave of internal movement, specifically hyper-urbanization. The demographic shifts outlined in the text are staggering. Latin America is currently at roughly 80% urbanization and heading to 90% by 2050. Africa is currently the least urbanized continent overall, but crucially, it has the fastest urban growth rate in the world at 3.5% annually.
And from a public health perspective, rapid urbanization without the corresponding development of civic infrastructure is a ticking time bomb.
Precisely. Let us apply this to disease modeling. When millions of people move from rural areas into sprawling, informal urban megacities that completely lack adequate piped water, sewage sanitation, and stable housing infrastructure, these urban centers become primary, ultra-dense nodes for infectious disease transmission.
They become amplifiers.
The local environment is perfectly primed for a localized outbreak, and the nearby global international airport is waiting to disseminate it globally within hours.
Which brings us perfectly to the core public health function, disease prevention and control. Let's compare how things used to spread versus how they spread now. The text talks about the historical Columbian exchange back in the 1400s and 1500s, where diseases like smallpox and measles crossed the Atlantic and decimated indigenous populations over the course of months, years, and decades.
Even the horrific 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed upwards of 25 million people, spread via the speed of troop movements and steamships. It took time to cross oceans.
But today, the temporal change we discussed at the very beginning, the acceleration of time, has fundamentally altered the epidemiology. A pathogen can board a flight in a dense megacity in Asia or South America and be spreading in a transit hub on the other side of the planet before the index patient even develops a fever or a cough. The incubation period of the disease is now longer than the time it takes to circumnavigate the globe.
That is the defining epidemiological challenge of our era.
Wait, earlier we talked about how different macro forces change disease metrics. I always get incidence and prevalence slightly mixed up when we start applying them to global economic policies. For the learners listening who might get pimped on this, can you break down the difference and explain how globalization impacts them differently using the textbook's examples?
Absolutely. This is a vital distinction for your clinical reasoning. Prevalence refers to the total number of people living with a specific disease in a given population at a specific point in time. It is the overall pool of disease. Incidence, on the other hand, refers strictly to the number of new cases of a disease developing in a specified period. Globalization impacts these metrics differently depending on the specific mechanism of action.
Okay, let's look at prevalence first. What's the mechanism there?
Consider the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The text argues that macroeconomic policies, specifically structural adjustment programs, have deeply impacted prevalence. These programs are often mandated by international financial institutions like the IMF when developing nations need loans. A common requirement of these loans is that the developing nation must reduce public spending and implement user fees for basic health care.
So they charge patients out of pocket.
Yes. This economic policy directly limits a poor patient's access to life-saving antiretroviral therapy. Because they cannot afford the user fee, they cannot get the drugs. This decreases overall survival rates, which therefore directly lowers the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in that population simply because people are dying faster.
Wow, that is incredibly grim. An economic policy drafted in a Western capital directly leads to a drop in prevalence because of increased mortality. Okay, what about incidence? How does globalization drive new infections?
For incidents, we can look at the globalization of the extraction and mining industry. Transnational mining operations, particularly in southern Africa, create intense, localized work environments characterized by poor ventilation, heavy silica dust exposure, and high population density in labor camps.
A perfect storm for respiratory illness.
The text notes that miners working in southern Africa have 10 times the incidence of tuberculosis compared to the general population. But it doesn't stop there. Because these miners are part of a highly mobile migrant labor force, their constant migration to and from the mines back to their rural home communities amplifies TB epidemics across the broader region. In this scenario, the globalized industrial practice is directly driving brand new infections. It is spiking the incidence.
That is such a clear, brilliant way to see how macroeconomics directly dictates local epidemiology. It also ties into a fascinating concept the text calls the democratization of risk. Historically, for a long, long time, infectious diseases like TB or cholera were almost strictly linked to poverty, poor sanitation, and overcrowding. If you had wealth, if you had a nice house in the suburbs with clean water, you were largely insulated from those threats.
That is true, but contemporary globalization has fundamentally altered who is vulnerable. The textbook uses the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, or SARS, outbreak in 2002 and 2003 as the prime example.
SARS didn't care how much money you made.
SARS did not discriminate by socioeconomic class. In fact, it utilized the tools of the affluent commercial air travel and highly modern air-conditioned hospital systems to spread to 25 countries within a matter of weeks. Highly infectious, novel respiratory pathogens democratize risk across the globe incredibly rapidly. Your personal wealth, or the GDP of your nation, no longer buys you immunity from a novel airborne virus.
And where are these novel viruses actually coming from? That brings us to a huge topic, emerging zoonoses and the concept of One Health. We keep hearing about zoonotic spillover.
The mechanism of risk here is largely driven by aggressive environmental degradation. As the global economy expands, We see expansive land use changes, the implementation of intense, dense agricultural methods, and massive deforestation. These economic activities force human populations, domestic livestock, and wild animal populations into much closer, more frequent contact.
What do the numbers look like on that?
The data is unequivocal. Roughly 60% of all emerging human infectious diseases are zoonotic, meaning they originate in animals. And over two-thirds of those come specifically from wildlife populations. We were talking about devastating pathogens like HIV/AIDS, West Nile virus, Ebola, and Nipah virus.
So as clinicians and public health professionals, how do we conceptually manage a threat that originates in a bat, moves to a pig, and then infects a farmer?
It requires a paradigm shift to the One Health framework. The origin of this concept, originally termed One Medicine, was actually coined by Calvin Schwab, who was considered the father of veterinary epidemiology back in 1984.
On health.
The vital framework here recognizes the absolute, inextricable biological link between human health, animal health, and the health of the surrounding ecosystem. You simply cannot protect human populations in isolation. You must simultaneously monitor and protect animal populations and maintain ecological boundaries. If you ignore the forest will eventually infect the city.
But to monitor all of this across human and animal populations globally, we need a massive early warning radar system. Our surveillance capabilities have had to globalize just as fast as the pathogens themselves. The text highlights PROMED Email, which is an incredible internet-based reporting system. It reaches over 60,000 subscribers in 185 countries. What's brilliant about it is that it crowdsources outbreak reports from clinicians and researchers on the ground, entirely free of the political constraints or delays that might slow down an official government report.
And formally, top-down global governance had to adapt to this new reality as well. Following the harsh lessons learned from the rapid spread of SARS, the World Health Organization significantly revised the International Health Regulations, or the IHR, which officially came into effect in 2007.
What changed in 2007?
A crucial conceptual shift occurred here. Historically, the IHR only required mandatory international reporting for a very small list of specific named diseases, primarily cholera, plague, and yellow fever. But the 2007 revision expanded that mandate to a much broader, highly flexible category: public health emergencies of international concern.
It's a huge difference.
It was a brilliant policy shift because it allows the global community to mandate a response to novel threats, regardless of whether science has even given the pathogen a name yet.
That flexibility is key. If we stay rigid, we lose. Let's pivot to the environment, because it's not just pathogens crossing borders, it's pollution. We mentioned earlier how multinational capital moves globally, constantly seeking the lowest production costs. In the realm of environmental health, this economic reality creates a terrifying phenomenon known as the race to the bottom.
Exactly. In order to attract foreign direct investment and build their industrial base, governments, especially in low and middle-income countries, often feel immense pressure to aggressively lower their environmental protections and occupational safety standards, or simply look the other way and not enforce the laws on the books.
They trade health for jobs.
They offer these weaker protections as an incentive to transnational corporations, simply to generate desperately needed local employment. We see the horrific results of this with the deliberate relocation of highly toxic, dangerous occupations like shipbreaking, electronic waste processing, or asbestos disposal, moving from highly regulated wealthy nations to poorer nations with minimal oversight.
For our learners, I want to pause and do another crucial differentiation from the text, because these two words get used interchangeably in the media all the time. Hazard versus risk. They sound like synonyms, but in the strict science of public health, they're completely different concepts.
Absolutely, and getting this right is essential for risk communication. A hazard is a potential source of harm. It is a thing. For example, a barrel of toxic chemical runoff, a batch of counterfeit antibiotics, or a silo of salmonella-contaminated grain. That is the hazard.
Okay, so then what's risk?
Risk, however, is a probability. It is the likelihood that the hazard will actually cause harm in a specific population under a specific set of exposure conditions.
So a shark in the ocean is a hazard, but if I'm standing on the beach, my risk of a shark bite is 0.
Precisely. And globalization makes assessing that risk a logistical nightmare. Because supply chains are now entirely global, tracing a hazard crosses multiple overlapping national jurisdictions. Imagine there is a multi-country foodborne illness outbreak. Identifying the original hazard requires unprecedented international data sharing, navigating wildly inconsistent food labeling laws, and legally gaining access to production facilities located in sovereign foreign countries.
It's a jurisdictional maze.
A hazard might be produced and packaged in one hemisphere, but the risk is experienced by a susceptible population in another hemisphere weeks later.
Let's ground this theory in a specific, devastating, real-world example of systemic impacts. The text details the South Africa cholera outbreak of 2000 to 2001, which resulted in over 120,000 cases. How does global finance trigger a bacterial outbreak?
This is a textbook, tragic example of the indirect environmental health effects of macroeconomic policy. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, required the South African government to implement specific structural adjustment programs as a condition of their macroeconomic engagement. One of the direct requirements of this policy was the privatization of local municipal water utilities and the strict introduction of user fees for water access.
Which they had to do to generate revenue to pay back foreign debt.
Correct. Consequently, the poorest citizens in these municipalities could no longer afford to pay for clean, piped, treated water. Their safe supply was physically cut off. Desperate and needing to survive, they resorted to drawing their daily water from heavily polluted local rivers and streams.
And the bacteria was waiting.
The inevitable biological result was a massive explosive cholera outbreak. This provides a direct, highly traceable line from a global financial policy drafted in an air-conditioned office in Washington, D.C., straight to a lethal infectious disease outcome in a rural South African community.
It's chilling when you connect the dots like that. It completely demystifies how these systems work, but it's sobering. But I want to make sure we emphasize that globalization isn't entirely a story of imported risk and environmental destruction. It's also about harnessing incredible new tools for intervention. Let's look at the positive side of information and communication technologies, ICTs.
The flip side of technological globalization is its revolutionary application for health promotion and healthcare delivery. We are currently looking at over 5 billion wireless mobile subscribers globally, with over 70% of those users residing in low and middle-income countries. This immense, rapid penetration of technology has given rise to the field of mHealth or mobile health.
The beauty of mHealth is that commercial wireless signals now cover roughly 85% of the world's population. It literally bypasses the lack of physical infrastructure. You don't need a paved road or a reliable physical electrical grid to reach a patient.
That's the power of it.
A clinician in a central hospital can deliver diagnostic test results, crucial health education regarding maternal care, or automated medication adherence reminders for TB treatment straight to a basic cell phone in an incredibly remote, otherwise inaccessible village.
It holds immense, undeniable promise for expanding the reach of care. However, as clinicians and scientists, the text strongly cautions us to maintain strict academic rigor. While the pilot programs are exciting, the large-scale, strict peer-reviewed evidence proving the long-term cost-effectiveness and actual clinical outcome improvement of broad health interventions is still developing. We must be careful not to view technology as a magic bullet that fixes underlying poverty.
Right.
Furthermore, the internet itself is a double-edged sword. It brings transboundary regulatory nightmares.
Oh, like direct-to-consumer online marketing. I see ads for insane miracle cures on social media all the time.
Exactly. Transnational online marketing of unverified, unapproved, or outright counterfeit health products completely bypasses the authority of national regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US or the EMA in Europe. If a website is hosted on a server in one country, managed by a shell corporation in a second country, and is selling unregulated to potentially dangerous dietary supplements directly to citizens in a third country, how does a national government stop it?
They almost can't.
It represents a massive, glaring transboundary regulatory gap that exploiters use to target vulnerable patients.
Which brings us perfectly to the realm of health promotion and monitoring in a globalized world. We've spent a lot of time talking about infectious diseases moving fast, but the true, massive, slow-motion tsunami facing global health is the NCD epidemic, non-communicable diseases.
We absolutely must frame the scale of this burden clearly for the learners. Non-communicable diseases, which primarily include cardiovascular disease, various cancers, chronic respiratory diseases, and diabetes, now account for approximately 43% of the total global burden of disease and a staggering 60% of all deaths worldwide.
60%.
And here is the critical paradigm-shifting statistic that shatters old medical assumptions. 80% of these NCD deaths now occur in low and middle-income countries. We must permanently erase the outdated idea that heart disease and diabetes are strictly a disease of affluence affecting only rich Western nations.
So, what does this all mean for how humanity actually lives and eats? The textbook explains this massive epidemiological shift through a concept called the nutrition transition.
Yes.
Historically, it used to be a reliable rule of thumb that a country's average dietary fat consumption was heavily dependent on its gross national product, its overall wealth. The richer the country, the more meat and fat they ate. The poorer the country, the more they relied on basic greens. But that rule is broken, not anymore.
The data points to a terrifying economic threshold. Obesity begins to significantly fuel major health inequities in the developing world when a country hits a GMP of just $2,500 per capita.
Think about how low that threshold is.
As soon as a population achieves just enough disposable income to move slightly above sheer subsistence, the highly efficient, globalized food industry floods that new market with highly refined fats, cheap cooking oils, and heavily subsidized processed carbohydrates. This dietary influx is usually coupled simultaneously with the introduction of labor-saving mechanized devices and motorized transport. Almost overnight, the traditional lifestyle becomes sedentary, and the daily diet becomes highly obesogenic.
Therefore, the entire philosophy of public health prevention has to fundamentally change. We can't just run simple, local public health campaigns, putting up posters telling individuals to make better choices and eat a salad. That's trying to stop a flood with a bucket.
It is entirely insufficient.
Health promotion has to act as aggressive upstream engineering. It must regulate the massive transnational commercial vectors that are structuring these unhealthy choices in the first place, long before the patient ever walks down the grocery aisle.
Precisely. This requires a leap in our clinical reasoning. If we accept that the vector for malaria is the Anopheles mosquito, we must conceptualize that the vector for the global obesity pandemic includes heavily subsidized corn agriculture and multinational corporate marketing campaigns, providing cheap, energy-dense foods to children. Effective health promotion must therefore operate at the highest policy, trade, and regulatory levels against these entrenched commercial interests.
And the good news is we actually have a proven blueprint for that, the FCTC model.
Yes, the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which was officially signed in 2003. This treaty is widely considered a historic triumph of global health diplomacy. It was initiated specifically because the tools of modern technology and global trade had severely limited the effectiveness of any purely national, isolated action against the tobacco industry.
Because if one country banned ads, the ads just beamed in via satellite from next door.
Exactly.
The tobacco industry fought this treaty tooth and nail, didn't they? It wasn't an easy win.
It was a brutal fight. The industry employed incredibly aggressive, well-funded opposition. They actively participated on national delegations to dilute the language. They heavily lobbied agricultural sectors and farmers, and they spent millions attempting to systematically undermine the scientific consensus linking smoking to cancer.
But the global public health community fought back innovatively. They utilized the internet and early email networks to organize a massive, unprecedented global civil society coalition. The resulting treaty was a watershed moment. It legally bound member states to implement strict minimum measures regarding tobacco taxation, comprehensive advertising bans, and graphic warning labels.
It proved unequivocally that collective transboundary governance can successfully counteract even the most powerful commercial determinants of health.
But to implement bold policies like the FCTC, you need rock-solid data. You need to prove the harm. And the monitoring challenges in a globalized world are vast. If I'm a public health officer, I can't just look at my own city's data anymore.
National data alone is no longer sufficient to see the true picture. If you look at the epidemiology of obesity, the demographics differ wildly depending on the region's stage in the nutrition transition. In established, wealthy nations like the UK and France, obesity is heavily concentrated in lower socioeconomic classes.
Right.
But in rapidly emerging economies like India and China, the data shows obesity initially emerges in the affluent urban middle class before eventually spreading to the poorer populations. Because these complex trends transcend national borders and behave differently across economic strata, relying on fragmented, isolated national health information systems leaves the global community essentially blind.
That's why the WHO established the Health Metrics Network, or HMN. We have to standardize and align how health data is collected and reported worldwide, or we can't see the global patterns forming until the hospitals are already overwhelmed.
This naturally and inevitably leads us to our final core theme: the governance of global public health. Because every single challenge we have discussed today, from regulating multinational pharma to sharing pathogen surveillance data to fighting the NCD epidemic, absolutely requires coordinated global governance.
Let's trace the evolution of that governance. It actually started way back in the 19th century with the International Sanitary Conferences. But let's be honest, those early meetings weren't about altruistically saving the world from disease. They were mostly wealthy European countries trying to protect their lucrative maritime trade routes from cholera outbreaks disrupting shipping.
That is historically accurate.
It wasn't until the aftermath of World War II, in 1948, that the World Health Organization was created with a mandate to try and truly universalize health cooperation and set global standards.
However, the modern governance landscape is incredibly crowded and complex. The WHO is no longer the sole, unquestioned director of global health policy. Today, you have the World Bank financing massive, country-level health infrastructure developments. You have powerful UN agencies like the UNDP. You have massive public-private partnerships driving vaccine development like Gavi. And you have heavily endowed, highly influential philanthropic organizations, most notably the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose annual budget rivals the WHO itself.
It's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And while they all generally want to improve health, they all have different priorities, different funding mechanisms, and different accountability structures. If we go back to our hospital metaphor, it's like a code blue is happening, but instead of one clear attending physician running the code, you have 5 different specialists shouting orders based on their own protocols.
That is a very apt analogy, and it creates what policy experts call a governance gap. The global system constantly struggles because, quite simply, there is no global government. There is no ultimate sovereign authority that can force a nation to comply with a health mandate if they refuse.
It relies on cooperation.
To understand why this lack of ultimate authority is a literal existential crisis, we must introduce a core economic concept from the text: global public goods for health.
Okay, let's break that down for the learners. I know a public good in economics has specific criteria. What makes a good non-excludable?
A true global public good is a benefit or a resource that no single person or nation can be excluded from enjoying, and crucially, one person's use of that good doesn't diminish another person's ability to use it. Think of the eradication of smallpox. That is the ultimate global public good. No one can be excluded from the benefit of living in a smallpox-free world, and my enjoyment of a smallpox-free world doesn't use up your enjoyment of it.
That makes total sense.
Other examples include global disease surveillance networks or cross-border coordinated polio immunization programs.
Right, if we eradicate a disease globally, every single human benefits, regardless of whether their specific country paid for the vaccination campaign or not.
Exactly. But here is the fatal structural flaw in the system. The free market will never, ever naturally fund non-excludable goods. Because private corporations cannot put a toll booth on an eradicated disease, they cannot charge for it and recoup their costs. Therefore, the market will not provide it.
It just won't happen.
In fact, the global market often creates massive economic disincentives for nations to provide these goods. For example, if a developing country has an excellent surveillance system and transparently reports a novel viral outbreak within its borders, they're almost immediately hit with devastating unilateral travel and trade embargoes from wealthy nations. It literally costs them billions of dollars to be transparent and protect the world.
The incentives are completely backwards.
Therefore, because the free market completely fails to provide these essential planetary survival mechanisms, collective transboundary governance, and coordinated mandatory public funding are both mathematically and ethically required. We cannot survive without them.
That is the ultimate so what of this entire deep dive. It's why this stuff matters on the ward and in the clinic. We need intentional, coordinated systems to pay for and manage the things that keep us all alive, because the invisible hand of the market won't do it for free.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up, let's lock this knowledge in. If you are a learner getting pimped on the wards tomorrow by an attending who happens to be passionate about global health, these are the concepts you need in your back pocket. I'm going to fire off some rapid single best answer style recall prompts. I'll read the question, I'll prompt you to pause and answer it in your head, and then our expert will break down the correct solution and tell you exactly where in chapter 1.5 of the Oxford textbook you can review it for your exams. Ready? Let's do this.
Ready.
Prompt 1. Which economic agreement or declaration specifically sought to balance strict global pharmaceutical intellectual property protections with the desperate need for developing countries to access essential, life-saving medicines? Take a second to answer.
The answer is the 2001 Doha Declaration on Intellectual Property Rights and Public Health. This was a critical moment where governance pushed back against commercial determinants. You can review the details of this in this section of the text titled Features of Contemporary Globalization and the World Economy.
Perfect. Prompt 2. What specific economic milestone acts as a critical threshold in developing nations, a point where the nutrition transition accelerates and obesity begins to significantly fuel health inequities? Pause and think.
The data points to a gross national product, or GNP, of approximately US $2,500 per capita. Once a population crosses this line, the influx of highly processed foods dramatically shifts the disease burden. Review this crucial epidemiological shift in the section, measuring and monitoring the health status of populations.
Prompt 3. What term describes the epidemiological dynamic where macroeconomic policies, like structural adjustment programs or enforced foreign debt repayment, severely restrict local infrastructure spending, directly leading to events like the devastating 2000 to 2001 cholera outbreak in South Africa? Got your answer.
This is a prime example of the indirect effects of economic globalization, specifically driven by structural adjustment programs. To understand this pathway from policy to pathogen, review the section under Protecting the natural and built environmental health in a global context.
Prompt 4. The vital expansion of the International Health Regulations, the IHR, in 2007 shifted mandatory international reporting from a small list of specific named diseases to what much broader, flexible category. Think about it.
The expanded category is public health emergencies of international concern. This semantic shift was vital for early pandemic response. This is detailed in the section Globalization and Disease Prevention and Control.
And the final one, Prompt 5. What specific economic concept describes essential health functions, like global disease surveillance or the eradication of polio, that the free market will not naturally fund because they are entirely non-excludable? What's the term?
Those are defined as global public goods for health.
Right.
Because the market won't pay for them, global governance must. Review this foundational concept in the final section of the chapter, The Governance of Global Public Health.
Great job.
To leave you with a final thought to chew on as you head into your next shift or study session, consider this paradox for your own practice. The exact mechanisms that make global pandemics spread so terrifyingly fast, and the exact mechanisms that allow the export of chronic diet-related diseases to the developing world, our incredible planetary transport, our instantaneous data sharing, and our hyper-efficient supply chain networks are the exact same logistical mechanisms required to rapidly distribute a global cure, to sequence a novel genome in days, or to coordinate a life-saving multinational health campaign. Globalization is the disease vector, without a doubt, but it must also be the immune response. How we govern that system will dictate the future of human health.
That wraps up today's deep dive into the planetary nervous system. Keep those concepts anchored, keep reading, and we'll see you next time. Here are the details of this episode. GPH 5, Globalization. Byline. When pathogens travel by plane and policies cross borders health in an interconnected world. Episode description. Globalization has fundamentally altered the landscape of public health. Diseases, goods, information, capital, and people now move across borders at unprecedented speed. What once remained local is now global within hours. In this episode, we explore how globalization reshapes determinants of health, patterns of disease, governance structures, and policy authority. Infectious diseases spread through global travel networks. Non-communicable diseases are exported through global food systems, tobacco marketing, and commercial expansion. Environmental harms transcend national boundaries. We examine the role of multinational corporations, global trade agreements, migration flows, and digital connectivity in shaping health outcomes. Health systems increasingly operate within global supply chains, financing mechanisms, and regulatory regimes. Globalization also introduces new governance challenges. National sovereignty must coexist with international coordination. Instruments such as the International Health Regulations and Global Health Treaties illustrate how law attempts to manage shared risks. Yet globalization is not solely a threat. It enables rapid scientific collaboration, vaccine development, global advocacy movements, and transnational solidarity. Public health is no longer confined within national borders. It is negotiated in global arenas of power, commerce, diplomacy, and information. Key takeaways. Globalization accelerates disease transmission across borders. Commercial determinants of health operate transnationally. Trade, migration, and environmental change influence population health. Global governance mechanisms shape national health policy. Multinational corporations significantly affect health environments. Digital technologies transform health communication and surveillance. Global collaboration can accelerate innovation and crisis response. Health equity challenges extend beyond national policy frameworks.